the Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, my online intuition development program for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the podcast, I'm speaking with Nikiah Seeds. Nikiah is a shamanic practitioner and a drum maker. She's a priestess and co-author of a really excellent book called Moon Mysteries. She's also an ordained shamanic minister and a death doula. So obviously there's lots we could talk about, but today I'm following the thread of curiosity that I have about Nikiah's role as a teacher at the College of the Melissa Center for Sacred Beekeeping. I spoke with Nikiah online. She was at home in Vancouver, BC. So Nikiah, thank you for being here. And just as we get started, I'd like to ask you, what identities do you lead with?
Ooh, wow, what an interesting question. Well, I think it really depends on the time of day, maybe, or maybe a month. And it's interesting. It's so interesting you asked that. I've been working with my students. I have I teach an apprenticeship in shamanism, and one of the things that we've been diving into is masks, and the masks that we put on in order to deal with, say, a grumpy sales clerk or a police officer. And there's a whole conversation there about identity. But I suppose if I were to I imagine you're asking a little bit about me. So I'm a mother, I'm a beekeeper, I'm a shamanic healer, I'm a writer. I do all sorts of really great fun things, sacred beekeeper. But I don't know, I guess if I got philosophical about it, I might say those were all just depending on the day and the mask I'm put on.
Right. That's great. I love that perspective of adornment. I will put on this identity today. Yeah.
Adornment, depending on what the muse calls for.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So you brought up being a sacred beekeeper. I guess before I ask you about bees specifically, can you unpack that identity a bit? What does sacred beekeeper mean, as opposed to conventional beekeeper?
Mm-hmm. Well, I got into beekeeping because of a sacred or divine calling. And so my approach to beekeeping from the very beginning always was about developing a connection to these sacred insects. And, of course, that came from reading, as one does, they get inspired. And so for me, getting honey was really secondary. And so I know some people will come at beekeeping from a more conventional place. Perhaps they want to start a business, they want to sell honey, or they need to pollinate their almond crop. For me, it had nothing to do with those things. And it was all about the sacred, divine aspects of the bee. And then the second way I came at it was environmental. So it was spiritual, and then it was environmental, and in that order. And I have a very dear friend who I began beekeeping with many years ago, and she came in from environmental first. Closely followed by spiritual. In fact, in some ways, one may not be able to untangle the two. But it was an interesting perspective for me to see her entry point and my entry point.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you tell me, I've always been fascinated with bee mythology and the symbolism of bees and this idea of them representing life, perhaps, and since my husband started beekeeping, a few years ago, several years ago now, I guess, and we started to recognize that there was sort of what we would call conventional beekeeping. It's kind of like conventional farming, meaning chemicals. And then there's organic or traditional beekeeping. I had no idea about that until he started beekeeping and we wanted to do things more naturally. But it sort of started to take me down that sort of internet wormhole of studying how were bees traditionally regarded. We have kind of a whole lore around them these days because we want to save the bees. There's colony die-off, etc. But I'm thinking more historically and from a mythological perspective, in the mythic imagination. What can you tell me about how bees have been regarded through the ages?
Hmm. Well, we do know that 10,000 years ago in Spain, we have the first record of humans beekeeping. And what it is, it's a cave painting. And we have this image of this long, tall ladder with these figures climbing up to harvest honey from, I'm presuming, up from either a cave or a cliff or something. And then it just goes from there. We have this rich, beautiful, mythological history of how humans regarded the bee. And so we know that it makes sense that in Egypt, because it's such a rich center, culturally speaking, they recorded so much that in Egypt we have, some of the oldest literatures in the world mention the sacredness of the bee. In fact, they believed that Ra, the sun god, so if you imagine the sun is, when the sun comes up in the morning, that's their god, and that when the sun god Ra cries, what comes out are actually honeybees drop down to the earth. So there's this really beautiful connection that somehow honeybees were a gift given to humans. Mm. And then if we go along a little bit later in history, beekeeping was practiced on a massive scale. It was practiced all throughout ancient Greece, Sumeria, Crete, into the Mediterranean. We have it in Spain. Of course, we have massive amounts of records in history from Egypt. The ancient belief that honey was this golden currency. And then, of course, there's an entire beautiful, rich history of goddess worship. Mm. The honeybee. So the ancient Artemis worshippers were called the Melissa, and they were the priestesses of the bee goddess. And I could talk for days and days about it. So
I love that because, of course, Melissa, hearkening to the etymology of mellifluous, which is like flowing like honey and all those wonderful things. It was so interesting when you said that there was the Spanish cave art, because that brought me back to, I guess, about 2.5 years ago now, for our honeymoon. My husband and I, we went actually with my daughter as well. We went to Europe for 2 months, and we spent a month in France. We went down to the caves near the Pyrenees at Nikiah, where you can still go inside and see the real paintings. And it just occurred to me now, we were so delighted and fascinated to look up at the mouth of the cave and see a whole bunch of honeycomb, which, some had been scraped away because it was such a large hive up there. And we just kind of thought like, oh, great, bees, because we keep bees, we notice them. But, that beautiful connection that, of course, the people who were going into the caves for sacred purposes probably would have thought of bees as sort of sacred guardians, or at least sacred envoys from some magical place, because how are they creating this beautiful magical nectar, which is, I love that you brought me back there. And of course, Artemis is a huge favorite of mine. I would love it if you actually just talked a bit more about Artemis and the bee. Like, what if we were to see a bee on an old Greek urn or something, would we then presume that was a Melissa who was worshiping? Would we, or was there something else there? What should we be thinking of when we see bees in any kind of symbolic way?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a very deep, rich, fantastic. And it makes me want to weave in a couple different things. So there's this beautiful image of the Melissa priestesses, and they have these beautiful sort of triangular shaped skirts, and you can see there's tears on them, the way the stripes on a honeybee's abdomen would look. And they're dancing, and their heads don't exist. All there is, if you look at the image, is these bees. And so this is where I'm going to start to weave things in a little bit. So you mentioned you were on honeymoon in Spain. Okay, so honeymoon.
Oh, yeah.
From the ancient practice of making honey into mead And of course, couples were given big jugs of mead to drink on their honeymoon, which would loosen them up and presumably produce a child. And so making mead is this really ancient thing. And of course, the bee priestesses or the Melissa would have been those in charge of crafting the sacred honey wine. And of course, if again, going back to that image, so they're literally off their heads, literally because they don't have heads, because what they would do is they would drink mead and they would go into ecstatic trance and they would dance and then they would have visions. And so this image, it's an absolutely classic image of these bee priestesses dancing, and their heads are bees. They're not, because they're off their heads.
So cool.
Yeah, it's, and so even if we take a look in France, we have the fleur de lis, and some cultural anthropologist or historian has made the connection between the shape of the fleur de lis and the honeybee. And that if you superimpose the honeybee onto it, it's exactly the same shape. And so you find honeybee images kind of snuck in. Of course, you know how they did. Find these little honeybee images snuck in this sort of mystical, maybe not, well, I always think Da Vinci Code, there's in there because there's some sort of secret hidden something or other that, mere mortals don't know.
Right. That's very cool. I love the idea that there have been codes, or that the images are encoded with some kind of ancient knowledge. We know that, of course, we should be worshiping these envoys from the sun, that sort of thing. So you talked also about being a shamanic practitioner. What role then does your shamanic practice play in your sacred beekeeping? Like in a kind of technical or practical way, what does that look like?
Good question. Well, it's not exactly something that I could ever teach, but for myself personally, it was my entry point into beekeeping. And so as a shamanic person, keeping bees and having an animist perspective that everything has spirit, and my ability to communicate shamanically with anything really, flowers, trees, bees, allowed me to start a dialogue or a communication with the bees that I work with. And so through that, I was able to keep them in a really different manner. I allowed them to guide me. And so there was that whole level. And then, of course, on a more personal level, even before I started beekeeping, journeying shamanically and working with my ancestors, I discovered that my personal blood ancestors kept bees. And so, because part of my lineage is Ukrainian Romanian, so my family calls themselves the Ukrainians from Romania. If you look that up, it's a thing. It basically has to do with moving borders. So my great grandfather came to Canada from Romania. And, there's a beautiful, rich European history in the Ukraine and Lithuania of beekeeping. And so there was this ancestral connection for me. And so as I journeyed shamanically with my ancestors, there was information coming through from them. And then as I was working on a more animist level with my actual bees, sitting in the bee yard, working with them, they were giving me messages and information on everything from I would go to the bee yard in a bit of a state, and at first I just thought, I'll just meditate, I'll just sit with the bees, and then messages would start to come through and they would actually start showing me things. I mean, the most goosebump kind of amazing things would come through. And so there was just this beautiful string that was being pulled through all of my shamanic work that had to do with the bees. And so then from there, it turned into this really beautiful thing. I mean, everything just sort of snowballed after that. There was this connection with the College of the Melissa in Ashland, Oregon, our own shamanic society here in Vancouver. I had this idea that maybe the society, as a member of the society, that I would keep bees for the society. And so one of the hives was designated for the Sacred Circle of Great Mystery Shamanic Society. And the honey from that would come to our ceremonies. And then that turned into this beautiful whole piece that has to do with our shamanic conference. And the honey, when we do get honey, is kept for either sacred ceremony or it's gifted.
Mm.
Or we do actually have a fundraiser that we do, and the money goes to the children that we sponsor in Africa and the Wolf Sanctuary in Alberta. So, it's turned into this really beautiful thing where the honey has become medicine in my spiritual community. So,
That's so beautiful. Well, and I have so many thoughts too of what you just said, because sitting with the bees, it really has to be one of the most quickly trance-inducing places I think you can be, right? I mean, sitting with the bees is so meditative. The sound, the forms they make, the repetition. It was such a wonderful thing to be sitting with the bees one time and realizing, oh, a beeline. Like when you say you make a beeline for something, it's because there is a track that it's just like an airport, right? It's like, oh, I'm in the beeline. That's why they keep thwacking me, or they're trying to get me out of the way. So it is a really it's pretty easy, I think, for many people to develop a relationship. And there are fears, natural fears, of course, especially if you're allergic or believe you might be, that sort of thing. And I know that it took us a while to approach our hive, without being fully protected and that sort of thing. We were a little nervous at first. But I was thinking as you were talking about the queen, have you had several queens now? Do you get a different relationship or personality from each one when you're communicating with the hive? Is it always kind of a collective hive mind, or sometimes are you kind of in direct connection just with that queen? I'd love to hear your relationship with those sort of different levels of your colony.
Such a beautiful question. Well, the queen, it definitely is a hive mind, I would say. So there is a queen, and she, if you name the queen, you name the hive.
Mm.
And so when there's a new queen, there's always a new name. And this is actually something that came through when I was working with the College of, I'm still working, I suppose, with the College of the Melissa, because they always name their hives. Always, always, always. Every hive has its own personality. And so that tradition continued on, where at the beginning, some of my hives would be named, but not all of them. As you know, as a beekeeper, as soon as you get to know that hive, you know the queen, and therefore you know the entire hive mind. So we've had Queen Boudica, we've had Hive Boudica, and we've had, which is a very fierce hive. And
yes, for those who don't know Boudica, or who might have heard her name as Boudica, can you just give a quick synopsis?
Absolutely, yeah. So she was a very fierce female warrior, Roman, I believe, and she led an entire army. I mean, she was killed in the end, but just the tenacity of her. There's many different historical fiction novels on her, and
she was in the UK. So for folks who feel drawn to more of a Celtic, or if their ancestry is the British Isles, we're talking really a predecessor to Victoria. And I've actually read that Boudica or Boudica is one of the ancient origins of the name Victoria, like victorious, because she was such a triumphant leader.
Oh, wow.
She's pretty badass, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so sorry, back to your hives. Yes.
Yeah, so then there would be the fierce one. Now I've only had one hive in all my years of beekeeping that was fiercer than that, and that hive was named Callie. But then we've also had more gentle hives. And so, even one hive that we named Avalon, because they just loved my apple tree so much. Avalon being the Misty Isles, specifically in Glastonbury area of the UK, and known for its apple trees. So, just depending on the, and also, once it doesn't take much to just sit and tap into the hive and sort of allow a name to come forward. So yes, so that would be how I would say the connection to the queen has come, and naming.
So I would imagine, for having been a sacred beekeeper for so long, then you probably have lost some hives and colonies then. What was that like for you?
Oh, the first time, devastating. We had a very elaborate funeral. We, the whole hive had died the first time. And, as a bee mother, I call myself a bee mama. So I get a bit fierce when the skunks are around and the wasps. And so as a bee mama, it was really devastating, and it was the whole hive, and we had to dump them all. We had a little burial, and we dug a hole in the garden, and we put them all in, and we threw flowers. It was very, but then, as any farmer, as anyone who works with animals or insects or whatever, we know that it happens. And so there have been years where I haven't lost, but there have been devastating years like last year, where the wasps, after our 3-year drought, the wasps were completely and utterly out of control. I mean, devastatingly so. And I had 2 hives the last season that were completely almost decimated by the wasps before I even went into the season.
So for people who don't know, wasps are carnivorous, and
Yes.
they are the jerks of the and they're not pollinators, right? So I don't know what wasps are for, but they actually, I read recently that there's been a study into insect personality, and that so I actually do think that wasps are just jerks. They're just like the douchebags of the insect world. So people to know that, like, you don't need to kill the bees, but you can kill the wasps. That's okay.
That's right.
They come in and they want to attack, and I guess they go after both the honey, but they're also carnivorous, so they'll actually just like kill bees and haul them off, right?
And at the end of the season, so the end of the summer season, they want protein.
Right.
They're eating the bees left, right, and center.
And the larvae and stuff. They're just raiders.
Yeah. So they raided my hives, and the one did die. And I thought that the second one going into the winter would be strong enough, but Mama has a feeling. And I went out to check the hive early in the season, like October. And it was after a really cold spell. So maybe it was late October, early November. And there'd been a frost and a drop below 0. And they just weren't able to make a good cluster ball. And they just all died. And I've never had that happen so early in the season. And so I didn't have hives. And then knowing that I was traveling to Africa this past summer for 5 weeks, right in the massive beekeeping season where I needed to be there the most, I actually decided for the first time in I think 6 or 7 years to take a season off. And it's the first time I've done that. So I took a season off, and I've rebuilt my entire bee garden and cleaned up all my bee boxes. And so I'm ready to start again this upcoming spring.
And so will you get on, like, here in Victoria, there's a swarm list you can get on. And if your colony, pardon me, has died off, you get to be at the top of the list. And so do they have something similar in Vancouver where you can get a swarm, or will you buy a queen and sort of try to start all over?
Yeah, well, if there is, I'm not aware of it. There very well might be here something like that here in Vancouver. My experience with swarms here is just sort of being, if you find one, there's someone close by, it's etiquette to ask if that might be their bees.
Right.
Otherwise, it's your swarm to keep. A little bit different here in the city, I think, maybe than in the country.
Right.
You'd be a little more hard pressed to just find a random swarm, although it's probably like that in the country too. I probably will buy a couple nukes from some of the local people here. So
that's like a nucleus or a nuclear or whatever. When you say nukes, right? You're getting kind of like the start of a new hive.
Yeah, so you get 3 or 4 frames, and that would include the larva, the baby, and the queen.
So much to learn if you aren't a beekeeper. I'm curious, when you were in Africa, did you happen to see any bee skeps or any bee stuff there that was new or different or interesting for you?
Yeah, I'm always, whenever I travel, absolutely every single time, no matter where I go, that's the first thing I want to know about. I wasn't able to actually go to any apiaries, which is the term we use for more than one hive. It's funny to think that I have an apiary here. And I did, however, it was one of those interesting synchronicities. I was staying with family. My husband's family's from Uganda and Nairobi. So I was in Nairobi with family, and I had mentioned, hey, I'm really interested in finding some African honey, or at least, if I could go to an apiary and have a little tour. Do you guys know anything? And my cousin-in-law's husband perks up and says, "Oh, well, I'm totally involved with this entire African beekeeping society group where all these beekeepers have supported each other in sustainable beekeeping, and he makes bottles." He's like, and I came up with. He was so proud of himself. I came up with this design of honey bottle, and that's how I know them, because I make their bottles. And then he proceeds to pull all these gorgeous circular round bottles out of the cupboard that had a flat side on I suppose the side of it, so you could tip it over and the honey would just slightly tip. He was so proud of this thing. So I was able to look up their website and read all about what they were doing, and of course I brought back gifts and bottles and bottles and bottles of the honey. And they had only just recently moved their main location from Nairobi into someplace really obscure that would have been hard for me to get to. So sadly I was not able to go, but I did make a nice connection, and I did bring honey home. Absolutely. And it's so different.
Oh, beautiful. That's really exciting. Now, you said the word or the term sustainable honey or sustainable beekeeping. And I just want to circle back to that briefly, because in the beginning you were talking about how your goal was not to pull honey. And this is another thing I think for people who are interested in keeping bees and they're new and sort of learning from YouTube or what have you, that's an important distinction. Can you just talk a little bit then about how the practice of sacred beekeeping is different from conventional beekeeping, and what would make beekeeping sustainable or not?
Okay. Well, sustainable suggests long-term. It suggests that we beekeep in such a way that we are taking everything into consideration, not just our own selves and our desire to have our bees live, but the long-term goal or sustainability of our earth, which would include the use of pesticides and also the bees. So we now know that a lot of our beekeeping practices just simply haven't worked. And that's why we're dealing with colony collapse disorder directly tied into the use of pesticides. Now, not necessarily pesticides that we're giving the bees, but neonicotinoids that are being given to the plants. So given all the information we have now, we really, for me personally, I really feel like it's a no-brainer. It's not a choice that I would, choose to make. And at a very basic level, we don't spray our weeds, our lawns, and we would hope our neighbors would do the same thing. Do you mind if I go on and on about this a little bit?
No, I would like it if you would, because I think a lot of people don't realize that there is sustainable beekeeping versus not sustainable beekeeping, and they don't realize why they should be buying their honey from the local farmers market as opposed to off the shelf in the grocery store. So please take your time.
Well, there's a fabulous book for anyone who really wants to get in depth with this called The Honey Trail, and I can give you the more information at the end of the show. About how a lot of the honey, a significant portion of honey you buy off the shelf isn't actually even honey, particularly if it comes from China. So that's a whole other conversation. It's mixed with other things, and it's really easy to replicate honey, and which is really sad. And then, of course, we take into consideration where the honey's coming from. So again, if you've got honeybees targeting the nectar, which is the, I guess what one might call the fat of a plant, the way we understand now that fish their fat can carry a lot of pesticides and things that aren't good for the human body. When you eat fat, it's a concentrated amount of that pesticide. So when we have bees that are specifically gathering nectar and pollen from, say, a giant almond orchard in California that's just sprayed to high heaven, the honey that they're bringing into their hive is going to be completely different honey than some little Joe beekeeper who's, bees fly within a 3-mile radius in any direction. So I always say, if we can just take care of our 3 miles, it's the one thing that helps to not bring complete overwhelm. If every person took care of their little 3 miles, it would all be good. So going back to sustainable beekeeping, what does that look like? It looks like taking care of our 3-mile radius. It looks like educating friends, family, and neighbors on their 3-mile radius. And then, of course, there's another whole aspect, which is to treat or not to treat our own honeybees. So honeybees get treated with different potions and lotions throughout the year. And, they are all fairly natural. For example, like formic acid, which is one of the things we give the bees. It's actually something that they create themselves. It's been isolated, targeted, and it's something that we give the bees to kill mites, which can become a problem. And so that's a whole other more political conversation. Some would say we've created this problem, and so if we don't treat our bees, they'll die. And in a sense, that's a little bit true. And so it's kind of a problem that we've created that we kind of have to keep up. Other more holistic organic beekeepers, now if we're getting really, really not fringy, but a little bit even more natural, if you will, believe that if you can generate generations of bees, they will develop their own resistances. And that what's happened is that we've bred the resistance out of them, kind of like we've done with antibiotics in our own bodies. So what a lot of these beekeepers do is, so for the small one like me, where I might have at a max giant season, I might have 4 boxes of hives. I might be able to do this. But when a person like myself only has 1 or 2 boxes of the hives going into a season, it's really hard to not treat them at all, because chances are good I'll lose all my hives.
Right, because you need a critical mass, because the bees need enough to keep them warm through the winter on less food, right?
Exactly. So I treat it for the last 5 years only with formic acid, no oxalic acid, nothing else, just formic acid. And I might do that twice a year, but ideally only one time. And that's been really great. I haven't had, I did have some pretty major mite problems a few years ago, but then the wasps came in. So some people, when they have maybe more like 6 hives or 10 hives, will say, these 4, I'm not going to treat at all. And it's okay. I can take the risk of losing them to breed bees that will become self-resistant. And then you split those hives into 2, and now you have 2 hives and 6 hives, 10 hives, and so forth, of bees that have over the time developed their own resistance to things. And so larger, a little bit bigger, it doesn't have to be a large scale, but a little bit bigger than myself, are really doing that organic beekeeping where they're, not treating at all, because they can kind of risk maybe losing. And I think that's a beautiful thing to do. And I think, if we have the opportunity to really try our hardest not to treat, it's a good thing to do. And, we all know that the minute you treat the hives, any honey they make after that isn't, you don't eat it. That says something, that once you give those chemicals, that honey doesn't get pulled.
Right.
For human consumption.
Right. Well, and then there's a whole other thing too about, do you feed? I had no idea that conventional beekeepers feed their bees sugar so they can get a surplus of honey. I was like, oh, wait a secon here. What?
Exactly.
And so, we've only gotten a few jars of honey in the years that we've had these. But it kind of just makes sense to me, because I think that ancestrally we had a much lower sugar diet. This is the kind of thing would have lasted a way longer time. As you said, you would have been using it as medicine in sacred practice. We wouldn't have such a palate that's so oriented towards sweetness, so that a couple of jars, that easily could have lasted a year, for a family. So once you're around bees for a while, you start to realize, like, wow, even the thing that we consider a symbol of wholesome naturalness, we've somehow pressed into service and distorted, and what's a good beekeeper to do, but sort of start from scratch and also learn how to take the losses. So just as we tie this up, I want to ask you a tricky question. The last question on the Numinous podcast for this season is oriented towards, shadow issues of life. It's been 2016 was a hard year. and I've been working with grief and rage pretty devotedly for about 18 months. And I think it's something that's really prepared me for kind of a collective long, dark night of the soul. And when I think about losing a bee colony, when I think about colony collapse, it's not just that you lose the relationship with those bees, it's that it's a signal of a larger disillusion the breaking down of things that we thought we could rely on collectively. So I'd love to ask you about how you personally cope with grief and rage.
It's such a powerful question, and it'll be interesting to see the series of your shows to hear what people say, because we all deal with it so differently. 2016 has been a really interesting year, and I find that I come at grief and rage from two different perspectives. So I have a lot of grief and rage about what's going on in the world right now, and instantly it goes to overwhelm. And actually, for that in particular, when I'm really thinking about the collective grief on a global level, actually, it truly, honestly, sincerely is the bees that bring me back. If I can tend to my 3 acres, or, if I can donate to the soup tent that we run, if I can do something right here and now, then that's all I can do. And that really helps the overwhelm. It really helps to deal with that. Now, on a personal level, when I have something that comes up personally that either makes me rage or grieve, really it's just about that still point. And I can't honestly say that in a really messy moment, I'm going straight to the still point. I maybe few of us maybe can, but knowing it's there, knowing I can access it, and remembering that is really, for me, the only way I can really come at those really intense, powerful things that I feel that we're validated to have. It's just how we deal with them in the moment, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. And you also shared a lot of resources. The Honey Trail is one of the books. I'll link to that in the show notes. And I know you have other resources as well. You also mentioned the College of the Melissa in Ashland, Oregon, where you are a teacher there as well. So all of those things will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and your passion for sacred beekeeping. Thanks for being on the show, Nikiah.
thank you, Carmen. It's been enlightening.
That was enlightening. There were a lot of really cool stories of the folklore and mythology of bees that I really appreciated from that. But I would like to credit my household beekeeper, Ruben Anderson, and welcome him back on for a rumination about sacred beekeeping. Welcome back to the show, Ruben.
Thank you very much.
What did you think?
First of all, Carmen, I would like to know if you think I have a mellifluous voice.
Absolutely. I tell you all the time. You have a great radio voice. It's very mellifluous.
So that was wonderful. All of the roots of honey, like mellifluous and Melissa.
Honeymoon.
And honeymoon, yeah.
Aw, yeah.
Just wonderful. Wow, I don't have thoughts so much as just kind of little anecdotes, I guess, that kind of come to mind. And so also I want to say the honeybees being the tears of the sun god Ra.
I know.
I'm going to think about that every time I'm outside in the sunshine.
I know. Nikiah, I just want to sort of shout out to her again, or like throw to her for a second, because I've done one of her drum making workshops, which was really fantastic, and she's got 1 million of these. She's so great with just kind of sliding in relevant little anecdotes and little spiritual teachings that are quite cross-cultural, which I really appreciate. Anyway, what did it make you think of?
Just going further on that, actually, it's an interesting. I guess I've noticed as we and I guess more me start trying to approach life in a more pagan way. I find little anecdotes like the tears or honeybees are very powerful and fit easily into life. Like, it doesn't actually cost you anything to see honeybees as being tears of the sun.
No, but it enriches the experience so much, doesn't it?
It enriches it beautifully.
Yeah, you're really you're really coming along in your interest in spirituality. The difference between like our first date, or even when I first met you, more than 10 years ago, being able to see spirit in so many things, you really are a natural born pagan. Okay, so what anecdotes did you remember?
So first of all, my great grandmother kept bees, as did her son, my great grandfather. My North American ancestors are largely Mormons, and the state symbol of Utah is actually the beehive.
That's right, like the skep.
The skep, yeah.
Which is, for people who don't know what a bee skep is, it's that kind of old-timey vintage woven, how would you describe it? Like it's a cloche kind of shape. It's a bell shape that's woven, just like in Winnie the Pooh.
Right. Yeah, the Winnie the Pooh style, so they're made out of straw usually. They can also be made out of mud or...
That's the state symbol of Utah.
The state symbol of Utah is the beehive.
Because there's so much about the family
and
the
the
group.
Food and the production. They were huge
production.
Agriculturalists.
Yes, and still are.
And still are. So I have I actually have this family, this bloodline of beekeepers as well. And apparently my great grandmother could work the bees entirely without a veil or without gloves. She would just go out and kind of talk to them and open the hives. But my great grandfather would get chased across the yard by the bees. And I just heard like a couple days ago that science now says that bees can recognize human faces.
Oh, wow.
So
amazing. That reminds me that my grandmother, as our listeners wouldn't know this, but I was raised for the formative young years of my life by my mother and her three sisters and my grandmother and my great-grandmother. So all of us 7 ladies in a 3-bedroom house with 1 bathroom. 3 of those ladies were beauticians. You can imagine it was a bit nutty in there. Anyway, she had a big garden, and there would often be beehives in the yard. And I think actually, sometimes she'd be out there, but I think it was actually the neighbor who brought them over. So they it's funny. They were just part of the landscape. I didn't really think of this as like, oh yeah, it's something that my people do. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, and you've never mentioned that before. That's interesting. I think you would have been playing out in the garden with bees all around you.
Yeah, totally.
Even as a little girl.
Yeah.
How nice. A couple of things. So I found it interesting that she kept saying keeping bees. Because keeping bees is a word or an outlook that is a little contentious in the, as she said, the more fringy bee circles.
Yeah, it's sort of a colonial term, right, of possessiveness, which we're trying to unpack a lot of the possessiveness that we have in our language. So what's the alternative, or what's a
she did say working with bees.
Oh, yeah.
But it could be living with bees. It could be, priestess of bees. I don't know, like,
worshiping,
something that...
revering the bees.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, working with bees. That's a cool way of thinking of it.
And then continuing with the thoughts. One of the things that I really noticed about bees is that they're kind of they're real mental gymnastics. Because I think as humans we try to anthropomorphize everything, and and it's a lot easier with like dogs and cats and horses and stuff. We kind of think we can understand what they're doing, but bees have a totally different social structure and totally different kind of goals and processes. So like at the end in the fall, they will kick all their brothers out to die.
Oh yeah.
And that's just they do that. That seems practical to them.
Right.
And so, so when we are trying to get in the mind, I'm making air quotes, of the bees, it's you have to, they're different species. Like they're a whole different, they're not mammals, they're insects. So
and their social structure is extremely different. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved it.
That's great.
It was wonderful
Can I
to listen
tell you something so cool that I learned? So our listeners wouldn't know this, but I've been taking a course in lost civilizations of old Europe. And of course, much of the archaeology has been, and the research really since like the 60s has been buried by patriarchal academia. But so some of the work is from Maria Gimbutas and others, but just in 2010, guess what they dug up on Crete. They found twin graves. So there was like a grave behind a grave that was to fool, like the one in front was to fool the grave robbers. But anyway, the woman that they excavated was draped in thousands of gold beads, about 1 inch long, in the shape of bees.
Wow.
I'm not joking. And it's from like the 7th century. So this is like 2,700 years ago. She was this high-ranking woman, this priestess, obviously, with these inch-long gold foil bee beads.
Wow.
Isn't that spectacular? Just in my mind. Anyway, I was very excited to learn that recently, quite a long time after I recorded the interview. The one thing I want to say is Nikiah brought up Boudica, and I just want to make one small correction there, because actually Boudica is not Roman. She is a Celtic queen, and she's so awesome that I think all women and girls should know about her, because she actually led a revolt against the Romans, and she laid waste to like some of the major cities, including Londinium, and left like 80,000 Roman soldiers dead. So I just wanted to correctly attribute her work, because I don't think she'd appreciate being called Roman. And I'm sure Nikiah knows that in the back of her mind somewhere, but was focused on the beast. So I just wanted to shout out to Boudica.
Badass Boudica.
Absolutely. There's links in the show notes to the things we talked about today and the books, and also to Nikiah and her book, Moon Mysteries, and her workshops. And yeah, I really want to thank her for being on the show. And we have so much other stuff we could talk about. She's a death doula. Yeah, so many cool things. So in the spirit of Boudica, let's do a shout out to our listeners in England today. East Anglia, if there's any there in particular. Thank you so much for spending time to all the listeners in England. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this podcast is a compliment to the Numinous School. If you want to know when registration reopens in June, just go to my website and get on my newsletter. That's how you'll find out. And while you're there, you'll see that there are wilderness quests that I'll be leading with my trusty assistant, Ruben, and they're happening in May and August. Get all the details at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.